My name is Annette Deleu, and you are listening to The Heart of You. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to The Heart of You. My name is Annette Deleu, and this is episode 37. So today I have Maryanne O'Hara, and she is an award-winning author, an end-of-life doula, and her book, Little Matches, A Memoir of Grief and Light, looks at life and death, motherhood, the pain of chronic uncertainty, and finding inspiration in the unexpected. Maryanne, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you so much. Delighted.
Let's just dive right in, because one of the things we like to sort of talk about on the podcast is people's journeys. That is what really helps other people on their journeys, obviously, when they're going through something similar.
Mm-hmm.
When you started really exploring the mysteries of life and death and the connections to the spiritual and everything in between, what started that? What was the crux of you getting into exploring that side of spirituality?
Well, what happened was the worst thing that can really happen to most people is that I lost my beloved only child.
Right.
And even though she had lived with chronic illness her whole life, we also always lived with hope. She lived an independent, very full life. And at the end, she lost her battle with cystic fibrosis, a lung disease. And at the end, it was still very unexpected and horrible. And even though I had worked with, as a volunteer with dying people in hospitals, it was all fresh and new to me.
Right.
And as a writer, I had never really been interested in writing the personal. But after Caitlin's passing, writing the personal suddenly became the only thing that mattered. And I wanted to write from inside real-time grief. So many people were saying to me, oh, you really can't write from the thick of grief. And I thought, well, yeah, I can, and I want to. And I know that my book would be very different if I hadn't written it when I did, which was exactly 9 months to the day of her death. And I didn't want to write a book about illness, death, grief. I knew as a writer, I knew I had to have a narrative arc, and that my book had to be about my journey. And what was my journey? My journey was looking for answers to the big life questions. So I start on page 1 with, I'm desperately reading what I call soul books, books that tell you, yes, we all choose a path before we come to this life. And they were all very comforting in the moment. But as soon as I closed the books, I would just be this desperate, grieving mother again. So the narrative arc of my journey is looking for answers to the big life questions. So by doing that, I came to really delve into that world, which I didn't know a whole lot about. My daughter Caitlin and I had always been interested in souls and, reincarnation, like the reincarnation work that's done at the University of Virginia. She had been very interested in that. And a lot of it made sense. But when she was alive, nothing was really at stake. And so after she died, I was grieving so hard that I wanted to believe it all, but I was even harder on myself than I ever would have been before, because I knew I was a grieving mother and I was therefore vulnerable, desperate. So I was very hard on myself. So I went through this time period of writing and looking for answers and recording that journey.
Yeah. Well, and a lot of times when we're going through things like that, any sort of grief, you second guess the things that you may already know. So even had you explored reincarnation and, things that you can do to connect with your loved ones on the other side, when the event actually happens where you're full on dealing with the grief of somebody's passing, you don't know how you're going to react. You don't know how it's going to affect you. And when you are in that space, of course, you're going to second guess all of the things that you either know to be true or have researched and said, okay, well, maybe that's a possibility. Right. Yeah.
Right.
And I think that's amazing that you were able to write through your grief, because I don't know, in my opinion, it feels like writing is one of those beautiful healing tools that you can use in any situation, really. But primarily when it comes to grief, writing things down. And I'm not a writer at all. So like, I mean, for me, writing it down just gets it out of my energetic field and onto the paper.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that's really beautiful. So that's how Little Matches came to be, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And also I had been keeping a blog before her death and after her death to keep people who knew she was sick updated. And it was the only thing after her death that made me feel better. Writing out into the world and sharing stories. I started sharing stories of all the synchronicities and signs that seemed to be happening in kind of a wondering way, like, hey, guess what just happened? And the most unlikely people would write back, strangers, and say, you know, I never really wanted to mention this because people might think I'm crazy. And I had so many stories like that I really, as I continued to write and decided to write the book, I really realized that there's a lot more going on than most people are willing to talk about. Mm-hmm. And that's when I really delved into exploring that world and checking out mediums and really taking note of and recording the signs and synchronicities that happened, to the point that I realized that to discount them just began to seem myopic.
Right.
They still are nonstop. They are nonstop with Caitlin. And different mediums have told me, psychic people, that she is a very powerful energy. And I believe it because she was in life as well. And sometimes the good do die young. She herself confessed to her best friend the summer before her passing, when we certainly hoped she would live, that she feared that her purpose in life might be to die, to teach lessons to others, which was rather profound.
Would you be willing to share some of those synchronicities that you get in the signs?
Absolutely. What happened, one of the main ones, and I know that birds are often a sign, are big white red-tailed hawks. And she was in the ICU in the hospital, and everything started to unravel all at once. And basically what happened was my husband put me in the car to bring me down home to take a shower. And I had never experienced anything like this, but we're getting on the highway, and a hawk came right up to my windshield, like right toward my face, to the point that I covered my head with my hands. I thought, my God, this bird is going to fly right into the car. It swooped up and over us. And I thought, okay, that must be a sign that everything's going to be okay. And I kept seeing hawks that whole week. And then after she died, I started seeing hawks even more. And I thought, okay, I was just being warned. I have such chills right now.
Yeah.
For example, one day, and I write about this in my book very early on, one of my friends came to visit, and I opened the back door to let her in. And suddenly she grabbed my arm. There was a hawk perched on my roof right above our heads, and it flew right over our heads, low over the trees. That's just one of many, many hawk instances, to the point now that we just sort of laugh and say, hi, Caitlin.
Yeah. Now I have chills.
I get chills all the time. But there have been also like some crazy synchronicities that are actually quite funny. And I write about those in the book too, where one day they were just nonstop, one after another. Out in California, I was in Venice. I visited a tarot reader.
Oh, okay.
On Abbot Kinney Boulevard. And I got all these meaningful cards, including the Ace of Wands. And right after I finished the reading, I was texting my husband. I'm standing in front of a teeny tiny boutique, and it had like one t-shirt in the boutique, and it was the same Ace of Wands imagery. And
wow,
a customer stood at the register spelling her name to the cashier, Caitlin. I mean, it was, and that's just two of about 10 synchronicities that happened in a whole string that I write about, to the point where I met up with my husband and I said, you're not going to believe this. And he said, yeah, I can. And he pointed to another synchronicity that was staring in our faces. So they happen all the time. They're often very funny.
Yeah.
I have a niece in Ireland who is an intuitive, and that is her business. And she's very gifted. And we used to always say to each other, unbelievable. And then it soon turned to, we just say believable now.
Oh, it's 100% believable. Yeah. So I have a question. So the place where you got the tarot reading on Abbot Kinney, was it Mystic Journeys?
No, it was called Tin Can Tarot. It was a little, it drove up onto the street and parked, which was another thing, because I was leaving a message from my niece in Ireland talking about this idea that I had for something that actually looked in my mind like the little tin can tarot. It's like a funny, cute little token-esque kind of like a car. And it was just one thing after another. It would be a long story to explain it all, but trust me, every single synchronicity that day was incredible and funny and wonderful. And one that I often read about, I read from my book. And when I do a talk and I give a legacy workshop to groups, and it's a very visually rich talk with a lot of slides. And I'm really good at taking pictures of all these things in the moment so that I can prove to myself and don't doubt myself. Yes, this really happened.
Yeah.
And one time, it was the summer after her passing. It was her birthday. She loved Martha's Vineyard off the coast of Massachusetts, and we were all celebrating her life there. And I went for a drive all by myself to the far end of the island to sort of recreate the last time I had been on island with Caitlin, and we had driven all the way out there. And I was driving along this very desolate road. It's always quiet, even in the dead of summer. You don't see other people. And I'm driving along and I'm crying and I'm saying, yeah, but the hawks and all that, if it's really true, why can't we really communicate? Mm. And I really started sobbing. And finally I said, no one will ever call me mom again. And I said it out loud. Mm. And I got to the end of the road where it dead ends at the water. And there was a guy all by himself out there, carrying a burlap bag with 3 big red letters on its side. And the red letters were M-O-M.
Wow.
I couldn't believe it. I snapped a picture of it and I just sat there in my car and I felt so overcome. And that's just been a wonderful thing. And also sharing these stories with other people. It turns out that M-O-M is some kind of grocery store in Delaware.
Oh, and okay.
A reader sent me, it's a grocery bag, and she found out where I lived and she sent me a grocery bag and with the MOM on it. It's in my car now. I mean, it's just the connections you make with other people are really wonderful. Mm-hmm. And knowing that you can share these stories is so healing and helpful. Yeah. So much more than just writing about, the sadness of grief. And I mean, right. we are all temporary. That's kind of my main message. We are all temporary. So don't feel sorry for me. I really appreciate all that I had and still have. And Caitlin did too.
And you continue to have, right? Because the relationship that you have with Caitlin doesn't end with her passing. It continues, right? So
it really does, doesn't it?
It just changes. It just changes the way that you relate to the person or the soul. And yeah, it makes a huge difference. I mean, this is not even remotely on the same level, but same type of synchronicity I had. It's amazing that it reminds me almost exactly how you were saying something out loud. So I had lost a cat, one of my, dearest pets. And so basically I had just dropped her off. I was driving back from the vet and I just was sobbing in the car and I said out loud, I miss you so much. And I'm not joking, within 2 seconds, I looked out the window as I was driving and there was a license plate on a parked car that said, miss you too.
Oh my gosh. Don't you just—
And I know. And I just lost it even more, right? Like It was just, so those types of synchronicities, those types of situations, it makes it undeniable for me, for people to not believe that you can be communicated with by your loved ones on the other side, whether it's a daughter, whether it's a pet, whether it's a mother, father, it doesn't matter. Just after my father passed, he was a really big fan of Charlie Chaplin. And I'm in Paris and I had just gotten the phone call that he had passed. And this was in December of last year. And so I'm just sort of walking aimlessly on the streets of Paris because, when you get news like that, you don't really know what to do. So I was just sort of walking and I looked up at the corner of a building and there was a giant picture of Charlie Chaplin on the side of a building. How and I was just like, oh, hi, Dad. Like, so okay, cool. So you're here. All right. Yeah. I mean, I could talk about those, the signs and synchronicities all day long because once you start recognizing them, once you start seeing them, the more frequently they come and in different forms and different ways. And yeah, It becomes your own language, right? It becomes
It
your own
really
language
does.
with the person that you lost, or the pet.
Oh gosh, yes, the pets. Yes to the pets. They're
Yeah.
so wonderful. In the talk that I give, I talk about how I started to doubt myself and I started delving into the science community's explorations of the source of consciousness and really braced myself thinking, well, there must be heart proof that, consciousness cannot possibly survive the death of the body. And I soon learned that no, there's no proof at all. And science calls consciousness the hard problem. And
Oh,
I finally come up
interesting.
with the, basically what I end up saying to my audiences is regardless of how they come to be or what you think about the source of synchronicities, the thing is they do exist. Synchronicities exist and they can comfort you. So why not use them? And they're part of the magic and joy of this life that we find ourselves living because honestly, come on, like I think of this all the time. Like humans started like in caves and on planes and everything that we created one day, not long ago, would have seemed incredible and fantastical and magical. And I just don't think it's that much of a stretch to think there's at least one other level of reality, more than the amazing, miraculous reality of the fact that you and I exist. And we have no idea how we came to be here and all of that. So I don't know. I think people have forgotten their place in nature and on the planet because we take far too much for granted.
Well, and I heard something interesting recently that was basically talking about essentially science just hasn't caught up with the reality of souls and the metaphysical. Like, so, and it's not that one has to exist without the other. They exist simultaneously.
Right.
So it's just a matter of, science catching up and being able to either quantify or prove the life after death.
And obviously it's very difficult. And I really appreciate all that, science has done. Yeah. And I understand that they have to be rigid. And I appreciate that. It's great for so many things. But yeah, they're really, we really are still so primitive in so many ways. Everything has changed so exponentially, especially in the last, century. But gosh, 100 years ago, things were so different. And I think of all the change I've experienced in my lifetime, it feels like magic. I often also quote that it's kind of a famous quote. It's often attributed to Yeats, but it was a man named Eden Phillpotts about 100 years ago who said, "The universe is full of magical things, patiently waiting for our wits to grow sharper." Now, how true is that? And really,
I love that.
I'm still amazed by telephones and the fact that, I can pick up my iPhone and do all kinds of incredible things with it. I'm not capable of creating that kind of magic. And I think it's easy to take it all for granted, but it's pretty cool.
It really is. When you think about everything that we've been able to do, even over the last 50 years, and this is something that, I've talked about as far as like life expectancy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I'm 48 years old and I'm saying like I could live to be 120 easily, because if you think about what has happened in the past 50 years, think about what's going to happen in the next 50 years of what type of advancements, scientifically and in general, in terms of like we're talking about how science and the metaphysical are going to start catching up with each other and that type of thing. Yeah. It's exciting to think about what could happen in the next 50 years.
It's crazy. If it continues as exponentially as it has been, who knows? It's really hard to imagine.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's dive into what exactly an end-of-life doula is.
Mm-hmm. Well, basically, it's like a birth doula, only on the other end of the arc of a lifetime. A lot of people assume that it's a medical position, but it's not at all. It's a support person. So basically, say that, you've received an end-of-life diagnosis and you just need someone to support you in any ways that you personally feel you need support. So it could involve sitting with the person, helping to craft funeral arrangements, hand massage, feeding the dog, basically any doing that needs to be done. I've long been a volunteer. I've always liked volunteering. And I used to volunteer in the Boston hospital where Caitlin went, actually. And I always preferred working with the people who were very sick or dying because there's just like no baloney and they really appreciate the time you give them.
Sure.
But I really, after Caitlin's passing, I had never heard of an end-of-life doula. I actually have a niece who heads up a hospice group in Maine. And until I took my course, she had never even heard of end-of-life doula. So it's a new sort of field and it's growing, but it's kind of scattered. And of course, like so many things in this country, if you can't afford to pay for it, you have to hope that you might find somebody who will volunteer to help you. But basically, yeah, you can hire someone to help with anything that needs doing. The good thing about the training is that, it's not just teaching you how to walk a dog or, fill out a funeral application, but a lot of it is all about the mindfulness of working with people who are nearing end of life. And one thing that I talk about is that after losing Caitlin, I felt like I was this big expert on grief. And I realized, no, I really went into this course thinking, well, I'm the expert here. And I realized, no, I am only an expert in my own grief. Everyone's journey is unique, and you really have to honor that. And the way everyone handles the hard news of end of life is unique as well. And it's also very easy in our culture to easily get into denial and hope for miracles and expect that TV or movie ending. We were guilty of that ourselves, and the medical people aren't trained for the most part to deal with this. So they will buy into it. And they, if insurance is going to pay for the last ditch efforts, they will go along with it. And end of life is often a lot messier than it needs to be. We spend so much time in our country, in many countries, preparing for birth and making sure that everything about birth is as good as it can be, and then hope for the best at the end of life. And the end of life is often
the messiest. Yeah.
A real mess and tragic in a way that it doesn't need to be. I do a talk with 2 other medical professionals, including a lung transplant doctor. We each have memoirs. We are all the voices of the patient, this woman's daughter who died. I'm the voice of the parent. He's the voice of the provider. And we speak a lot to hospital grand rounds programs. And we share 3 different perspectives on problems with just expecting that, end of life is going to be something that's easily handled.
Right.
And we saw for ourselves how we thought we were pretty prepared, but suddenly everything spiraled out of control. And Caitlin was in the ICU and we weren't prepared. And her doctor was a wonderful person, but he wasn't prepared either, because he was saying things to me like, we'll get you, she needed a lung transplant. We'll get you transplanted, Caitlin. Yeah, I've got a good feeling, saying all these things to keep us upbeat, but they weren't real. And but I also wasn't really sure, because I thought, well, I don't know everything about the transplant world. Maybe his good feeling is really a valid feeling, but it wasn't.
Right.
So at the end, when you are in an ICU and you're amped up on, adrenaline and cortisol, you are incapable of making a good decision. So that's when it all happens, like desperate, do everything it takes. And it's also interesting to see how people will fill out these end-of-life directives before anything's wrong with them. But then when the time comes, they change their mind. It's really hard to imagine what you're really going to think about at the end of life, when death is imminent, because it's just theoretical before then.
Right.
And it's scary.
And a lot of times I think people write their directives when they're much younger, obviously. Mm-hmm. So I'm thinking of my father specifically. And I think that he wrote his end-of-life directives in 2010 or something like that. So when he passed last year, his actual directives that he wanted for after he passed, he wrote to my sister and I in an email, which it doesn't mean anything in terms of, legally, right? Like that has to be in writing. And so it created an issue because we can't now fulfill his wishes because there's a dispute with his previous wife and things like that. So like there's all these things, and it's, and you think that you have all of these things completely buttoned up. My dad thought he had everything buttoned up. He had everything written down. He had all the legal papers. I have a binder like 3 inches thick, but it still didn't take care of everything,
No, but the good thing about talking about all of this is it does bring awareness to people to at least think about it.
Yeah.
Because people don't think about the end of life. And it's amazing how many people don't even have wills and just kind of, again, hope for the best. And I like to tell people, make a plan for the worst and then hope for the best, because making a plan for the worst can reduce a lot of anxiety. And it's hard to think about what the worst means. It's scary. But if you can face it and make a plan, it really does take away some of that fear and anxiety. And oftentimes the worst doesn't happen, which is wonderful.
Yeah. Have you looked at the Akashic records at all? Have you had any Akashic record readings? I'm curious because there are some interesting things in the Akashic records that I've seen that relates to this, but I'm curious to know what your knowledge is. Yeah.
The Akashic records is one part of that whole world that I don't really know much about. And it's one of those things that seems a bit fantastical. Like how can they possibly really exist?
Right, right.
I don't know a whole lot, and I find it fascinating.
One of the things that I think can be really helpful for people, and I think it depends on how open they are, of course, but some of the things that I have seen in the Akashic records is that we actually choose how and when we're going to die. So that doesn't always happen that way. Obviously, there are, we all have free will, so we can do various different things and change the outcome of what that plan was. Or if something happens that was, not meant to happen, something traumatic or something like that, sure. But most of the time we have a plan as to how long we're going to live, what we're going to do, how we're going to accomplish the things we're going to accomplish, and basically decide when we're going to exit. And it's interesting because there's a gentleman named Edgar Casey who was considered sort of the grandfather of the Akashic records. Mm-hmm. And there was a quote that I saw recently online that said, "Death in the physical is simply birth in the spiritual. And birth in the physical is death in the spiritual."
I like
Which
that.
I thought that was a really beautiful way of putting it. It's just a transition from one to the next.
Exactly.
So it's interesting because when we look at the Akashic records, we can actually see what your life purpose is and why you came here. And so it's been very, very rare that you could see or ask, hey, so can you tell me how I'm going to die and when? Most of the time, they're not going to tell you that information because it would have an effect on how you would live out the rest of your life.
Oh, for sure.
That sort of those beautiful mysteries that you're talking about, those beautiful things that we experience that people a lot of times take for granted would almost be overshadowed by knowing certain information. And that's also the case with any sort of psychic reading or anything else. It's that your guides and your team on the other side, they're only going to give you the information that you need that's going to allow you to stay on your path versus just giving you information just so you can know it, right?
Exactly.
So, yeah.
Which makes sense. Otherwise, why are we really here?
Right. When it came down to end of life things to do, meaning, doing the will, getting all of your affairs in order, I was thinking, having an Akashic record reading, even if you've never had one before, would probably be one of the most beneficial things for people to have. So they can sort of know, okay, what was my life purpose? Did I achieve my life purpose? And what do I need to know going into the next life? Because oftentimes you'll be able to sort of prep your soul for what happens after you cross over, and it can help you. So that whole concept of being able to merge not only what we have to do in the 3D world,
right,
but then also merge that spiritual aspect with it.
Well, that's right up my alley, wheelhouse, whatever, because my favorite part of the training for being a doula, and one of the things I love to do with groups of people and also with individuals, which I would do on a volunteer basis, especially people who are like older, is life stories, legacy interviews. And I run this legacy workshop, and I love doing it, where I talk about legacy and meaning and purpose and finding your life's, trying to find out what your life's purpose might be. And then I lead people through a list of sample questions that they can use with a loved one. And it doesn't have to be at end of life or sickness. It's a great tool for self-reflection as well. And it can be a wonderful tool to start up a meaningful conversation with a loved one. But I love to have people go through these questions and I leave a lot of silence at the end of the workshop when I ask the questions, so they can ask them the questions of themselves. And a lot of that is sort of thinking, well, if just pretend it's true, that, even if you don't believe it, just pretend, play a what if game. You came into this human life with a plan, and look back on your life and think of the things that happened to you, even if they were, obviously, especially when they were hard and you had struggles. What did your soul learn from those hardships, and how did you grow? Looking back, you can usually figure out what your intention might have been, or are you on the right path? So I love giving those, and I think that so what you're saying about the Akashic record sounds, very similar. And is it true that we have like a couple of outs during a lifetime, not just one?
It depends on whatever the plan is that you've put in place for yourself. So yeah, I mean, it is possible that you will have a couple of outs. There have been times where I've seen previous lifetimes with people where they're so far off their life path that there is absolutely no possible way that they're going to be able to achieve it. So their soul might decide to just check out early.
Wow.
Like it's kind of like a reset button where they're like, okay, and we're done. We're going to reset and we're going to try this again another time, because sometimes we're too ambitious about what we want to accomplish in a particular lifetime. And let's say it is about, forgiveness or overcoming addiction or something like that. That's really heavy. Then it might take several lifetimes before you achieve that. But if you totally took a left turn and there's no way back, that can happen. Yeah.
I find that really interesting. And one of the things I wrote about in my book was that I looked back in those early days of mourning to my childhood, remembering things, remembering that I used to talk to trees, remembering that I used to wonder why people were afraid of physical pain, because I knew that if things got too bad, you could jump out of your body. I can remember sitting in my third grade classroom. I can remember exactly where I was, my feet on the floor, my hands on the desk, thinking I've made a mistake. I need to start over again. As if I could, but it felt very real. And I had forgotten a lot of that stuff. But as I was grieving my daughter, so much of it came back. And that really got me so interested in all of this. And when she was 11, she was very sick. We almost lost her when she was 11. She had to have part of her lung removed. She had a horrible infection. And she came close to dying. And like 10 years later, she had this thing called a soul reading. She was the first person to sort of get interested in all of this. And this woman read her, from afar, never met her, just here, call this number. And she said, did you have something happen to you when you were 11? You came very close to dying when you were 11. And she specifically said the age of 11. And then an astrologer said something similar to her, that all of the planets were in such force against her when she was 11, that she came very close to dying when she was 11. So I always thought that was pretty fascinating. And to have it from a couple of different sources was pretty amazing.
Yeah. Well, and actually, everyone can read their Akashic records. It's just a matter of if you are in the right frequency, if you will, like you're tuning into the right radio station, and then just, being able to be trained in it and to know how to do it. I didn't know I had this gift until much later in life. I always had these sort of inklings, sort of like what you're talking about, in childhood, the little interesting happenstances. Or I remember there was a reading that I had gotten really early on in my spiritual awakening where a reader had told me, she's like, oh, I see you, you were talking to fairies when you were a little girl. And I was like, when she told me that initially, me and my adult brain was like, okay, lady, like, I don't know what you're talking about, but okay.
Right.
And then as things happen, when you start waking up to the reality of everything that happens beyond this 3D plane, it becomes undeniable. And then you start understanding. And then once you open your eyes to it, it's literally about just sort of unlocking those little doors that you have, that you already have these abilities. So I would not be surprised if you specifically, Maryanne, have the ability to access the Akashic records and you just haven't done it yet.
Right.
Yeah.
Which is such a cool thought. And I've been told things like that in the last couple of years. And it's been really interesting sort of returning to my roots, so to speak. Like every morning I go outside now and I make sure my bare feet are in the grass
Yeah.
I touched trees again, and oh my goodness, I forgot the energy you can feel from a tree.
Yeah.
When I was little, I would tell my mother things and she would say, "Who told you that?" And I'd say, "The trees told me." And I'm like, man, I wish I could I wish there was a little video camera on little Maryanne. What were these trees saying? What was she saying back to them? It's pretty cool.
Oh, that's adorable. I love that.
I just spent the last month in Ireland, where my husband is from. And especially with my niece, who is the intuitive, healer there, it felt very magical. And I rented for 2 weeks this beautiful farmhouse on this piece of land that just felt super magical to me. But I didn't say anything. I wanted to see what the niece felt, because she really feels energy. I mean, there's no question. Right. And she was like, "How did you find this? This was so wonderful." And the man who owns it is a sculptor from France. And he had built this stone circle in front of the little cottage. And it definitely had energy. Like, I could even feel the warmth, the difference in it. And one of the really cool things was, and talk about synchronicities, there were 12 stones in the circle, and the main stone that faced the winter solstice, he said, "And this is the Leo stone." And we're like, "What? Leo stone?" And it's a story, but my daughter's best friend, the one she said, "I fear that my purpose in life might be to die." Yeah. This best friend, who then has been dealing with stage 3 breast cancer herself, has created, in Caitlin's honor, in Kenya, since 2018. She started fundraising. In 2020, she opened the Leo Project, a resource center for children in honor of Caitlin. And then COVID happened, and they all had to pivot to help the community. And now the Maryanne O'Hara Community Health Clinic is about to open in Nanyuki, Kenya. And the big name there is Leo, and Caitlin was a Leo astrologically. The two girls went to a high school where the mascot was a lion. And so
that's beautiful.
We rented this place, and then the 2 weeks we were there at this house, I didn't even want to leave. I was so happy there. It just felt wonderful. And the fact that the Leo stone, and the stone sort of looked like Jess's logo for the Leo Project, this sort of long, sort of cartoony lion face. It was pretty cool. Wow. Like, come on, like my husband and I were just looking at each other like, and then my niece was, she's not surprised by any of that. And she said, "Do you want me to do a reading?" The first day she came into the house, she sat down at the farm table. "Do you want me to do a reading?" I was like, "Of course I do." And she put out her cards, and a monarch butterfly flew in the window, the open window, flew around Sinead's face. And Sinead, I was like, I'm astounded. And Sinead's like, "Thank you very much for coming. You can leave now." And the butterfly flies away. And I'm like, man. And she's like, she really helped me to open up even more in this past month, and not to doubt myself. Like I said to her, I had a dream 2 nights before the Queen died. The Queen died. And I said, "But, what a coincidence, 96-year-old lady dies." And she's like, "Don't deny it. Just accept it,
Well, and that's how you get the sort of the little energetic nudge that, hey, we're just letting you know that this is real, and you are talented in this, and you can access this information. And yes, of course, it was 2 days before it happened, and you could very easily dismiss it because she was older. But it's like, I find that they give you the things that are the simplest first, because if they give you things that are complicated, that you would have to sort of suss out or figure out, or maybe, for me, I had a dream, and I started a dream journal actually for this very reason. I had a dream, but like, I would have not known that everything in the dream was accurate had I not written it down, because I would have forgotten it.
Right.
But, 6 months in the future, I'm taking the exact same plane number that I saw in my dream. I'm taking the exact same time, like all of these things. And it was warning me, that dream was warning me actually of a disaster that was going to happen with the job that I was on for that trip. So, I mean, it wasn't life or death, but it was, the job just didn't go well. And it was of no fault of my own, but it was just sort of one of those things where, like, my dream was telling me 6 months ago, hey, if this job comes up, don't take it, because it's going to end up not being very pleasant. And I'd completely forgotten about it until I went back and read the dream journal. I was like, oh, well, I guess I should read these more often now, because had I read it, I would have not taken the job. Right.
Yeah.
But so it's like, our memories, we think we would remember everything, but we really don't. And
no, oh God, no. The older I get, the more I realize that just doesn't happen. Our brains are too full, and there's so much stimuli all the time. It's such a noisy world.
It is. And that's why, when you were saying to write things down, like, yeah, absolutely. Write everything down, especially in important times of growth and grieving. And for me, like, I feel like grieving and going through hardship is synonymous with growth. It just is,
It totally is.
And it is the most important time for anybody to write down what you're experiencing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
Great. So you have something else in the works you were mentioning. Is this something you can talk about or no?
It's a novel. I had been a short story writer for most of my adult life. And over the course of the 2000s, a bunch of short stories turned into, they didn't want to be short, and they ended up becoming a novel. And I ended up really falling in. I published my novel exactly 10 years ago. And it's basically about the personal and cultural salvation that is art and being an expressive, creative person who's looking for meaning in life. So, but it does have a good plot too. But I realized I loved the long form because, again, it is a noisy world, and short stories they're hard to publish. There aren't many markets for them anymore. They don't really get read. And a novel at least exists forever. And so I started writing another one, and we were waiting for Caitlin's transplant for far too long, for almost 3 years. And during that time, I carved out time every day I get obsessive, and I was working on this new novel, which is about memory and storytelling and the unreliability of memory. And,
interesting. We were just talking about that a second ago.
Exactly. But again, and lives of meaning and purpose. And I realized practically everything I've ever published has had some kind of like artist as a main character, whether it's a musician or a painter, or like in the novel, it was a painter. And in this book, it's a photographer, and his father was a painter. So anyway, that's sort of an obsession of mine. But I worked on it, and I refused to let a day go by during Caitlin's wait for transplant without writing. And in my desk here, I've got index cards where I would circle a date every day after I'd done even if it was only 30 minutes every day. You can get a lot done in a focused 30 minutes. Yeah. And my goal had been to have a readable draft done by the end of that year. Mm-hmm. And Caitlin went into the ICU on December 5th of that year that she died. And she just died December 20th. And I had no interest in it at all. And I wrote the memoir. It came out in April of 21 in hardcover, and it came out just a few months ago in paperback. So I've been very busy with that, doing a lot of speaking.
Yeah.
But I finally felt ready to go back to it because Caitlin had really liked it. She had been a brilliant reader, my best reader. Mm-hmm. She'd been the only one who had read it because it was very rough. And so I spent the summer creating a draft, and I actually have it all hanging up in my hallway.
Great.
Because I love to hang up the pages once I have a draft, and then you can sort of walk inside of them, and you realize that a narrative is not set in stone, that you can move things around. You can see, this needs more attending to. These characters need to be developed. So it's about a guy who had something really life-changing happen to their family when he was 11 years old, and he happened to take a photograph of it. And it's the repercussions of that for the rest of his life.
Wow.
And it has a lot to do with the whole, what memories are accurate? How do we remember? It's really been fun. When I did go back to it, I was really pleasantly surprised to read what I had written, and also to realize how much research I had done. I had done a ton of research down in Washington, D.C. on oral histories and all of that. So,
yeah, it's possible that you needed to write that at that time because during that time you were not going through the full-on grief process, right? So it's like you needed to get that done ahead of time because it's like your soul knew that moving forward, you were going to have this period of time where you were going to be letting it go. But yeah, it all happens always in the right timing, right? Especially with inspiration when you're tapping into that universal consciousness. And
yeah, it's pretty interesting.
Beautiful.
A lot of little matches. My memoir felt like a download. I can't even really remember writing a lot of that book. I know my husband was worried about me. He had seen me like slumped over the keyboard crying. And he'd say, "Why are you doing this to yourself?" And I'm like, no, it's good. It's all good. Mm-hmm. And I really don't have a strong memory at that time, but the words it needed very little editing. It just came out.
When it comes to channeling, it's so funny because I think a lot of authors probably channel their material and don't even realize that they're doing it. And you
It's
know,
like young Mozart.
yeah,
Come
exactly.
on.
Exactly. Well, and that could also possibly be the reason why you have such a fascination with artists. I mean, because you said you have your MFA, correct?
Mhm.
And to have connection to art in any way, whether it's writing, visual arts, sculpture, any sort of creativity, you know, you tap in, it's the easiest way to
Oh,
tap
yeah.
into that universal consciousness.
It's wonderful.
Yeah.
In my first novel, Cascade, the main character is an artist, and I had to create paintings and describe them and describe the process. And every time I would do an event around that book, people would say, you must be an artist. You're an artist, right? And I'd say, no, I wish I could make those paintings, but I can see them. And it does all come from the same source. Like I know what it feels like to want to create the painting and then to create it or to feel frustrated. Because it's the same with writing, same with anything creative.
Oh, yeah.
I think the best of all of the art forms has to be singing, because then it's your body too. But I don't have that gift.
Everybody has their own gift in their own strengths, you know, according to their soul plan.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting because since I was 5, I knew I was going to be a designer. Like I knew that's what I was going to do.
So great.
And I was, and I still do design work, and I still do, you know, sculpting, and I still do furniture design and that kind of thing. And it's stuff that I do that is more sort of to kick in those creative juices, because when it comes to manifestation, that is like the easiest way to manifest, is to just like put that energy of what you want to manifest in your life into something creative, because it's that creative process that creates that beautiful energy. The turn that my life took when I started doing the spiritual coaching and the Akashic readings, I never would have guessed that. Like from early on, like never would have guessed that's where my life was going, and that's where it did. And I was like, okay, cool. I guess this is going to happen, you know?
Yeah.
So you never know what kind of surprises are around the corner for you in terms of what new spiritual gifts are going to be popping up for you.
It's actually really kind of fun.
Yeah, absolutely.
I love it.
Well, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much.
If you don't mind giving everybody your contact info, your social media, how people can get a hold of you. I know you had mentioned before we were just chatting a little bit, you were saying that you love hearing people's stories and their connections to what you write.
It's really funny when I love hearing from readers. Yeah. And it's so funny how oftentimes people will say, like, I don't want to bother you, but I just had to tell you how much your book meant to me. And I'm like, of course I need to hear that, because especially in the last couple of years, almost every event I did was on Zoom. And I felt like I was just speaking into the void, because I kind of was. And knowing that there are people out there who are listening and being affected by what you say and by what you've written is wonderful. So yeah, I'm kind of lucky. My name seems like it would be kind of a common name, but it's not. It's Maryanne O'Hara, Maryanne O'Hara. And I guess I'm like the only one, because I've got MaryanneO'Hara.com. I've got Maryanne O'Hara for my handles on social media, and Maryanne O'Hara author is my Gmail. But yeah, I have a good website. I've got a great little a 2-minute trailer on there, or 1.5-minute trailer, where I talk about my book. And because I have an artist brother who's really good at all that stuff, and he made it for me. So it's a good website, and I encourage people to check it out.
Yeah. And also you can purchase Maryanne's books on the website. There are links to Bookshop, which I love. It's, supporting local bookstores. So Little Matches is the memoir, and Cascade is the novel that Maryanne was speaking about earlier. I'm very much actually looking forward to the new novel. I'll definitely be picking that up.
Thank you.
Do you know whenabouts that's going to be coming out?
Well, I have to finish writing it, and then my agent has to sell it. But she's a pretty good agent, so hopefully I just have to finish it. But I'm excited. I feel like it's nice to be back working on it. But usually once, like, she sold Little Matches in October of 2019, and it came out in April of 2021. So there's a big chunk of time between when a book is accepted by a publishing house and when it actually comes out. It's quite a machine. So it'll be a while.
Got it. Well, the thing is that, I mean, it's clear that you're meant to do this work. So I don't think it's a matter of if, it's just when.
I'm excited.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, wonderful. So thank you everybody for joining us today. And like Maryanne said, if you would like to get a hold of her, you can reach her on her website at MaryanneO'Hara.com. You can reach me on my website at infinitesoullove.com. You can also reach me on all social media at infinitesoullove1111. Thank you so much. And don't forget to leave a review for this podcast. It really does help the algorithms and it really helps boost the podcast itself.